Hi everybody, I'm Dan Clark from Resimion. What I'm going to do today is just talk through what Resimion is very quickly. I'll also talk through what we've learned as a result of using the Resimion platform with universities around the world in terms of student engagement, in terms of professionals engaging and using it for CPD and so on. Okay, let me jump into the presentation. So, what is Resimion? So you may have heard of Resimion before. I know it's been mentioned in some of these sessions before. Resimion is a scenario-based learning platform that's accessed via web browser or smartphone. And what it does is allow design and facilitation of scenarios such as crime scenes, for example, or even basic tools such as multiple choice questions, problem-based scenarios that require maybe evidence investigation or gun crime or so on. And what it does is provide a very kind of immersive environment for students to have a fun experience with a countdown, earning points, working through using gamification to give summative or formative assessment as you're working through a module or a lecture or another training environment. And students get to work through those problem-based, which can be very simple or complex scenarios. Maybe it's risk analysis, maybe it's a simulated interview, for example, a CSI turning up at a crime scene in that initial interview. Maybe it's looking at lab processes and procedures or similar. And it's based on Kolb's experiential learning cycle. So the whole idea is students are presented with a problem, as you can see here on the right-hand side. It's the first officer attending interview. They're presented with a problem. They work through and make decisions that allow them to get back information or facts that then allow them to make more decisions and work through to some form of objective or conclusion based on the learning objective that you've set up. So how did this start? It actually started as a hobby project. My wife is a lecturer at one of the universities here in the UK and wanted to engage 200 hematology students inside a lecture. And we were looking at a way that we could take those students, get them to use their phones in a much more engaging way rather than just looking down at their phones while a PowerPoint was running. What we wanted to do was get them to become a bit more competitive with each other, to absorb the content that they were actually that they'd actually learned and apply it in a scenario-based learning environment. And actually now Resimion, which stands for Research Simulations, Resimion's become much more focused on policing and forensic science and some of the other biosciences, where having gone from a hobby project, we've now got 6,500 students signed up over 8 institutions, and we've run 9,000 different scenarios. And those scenarios are everything from policing-based interviews right the way through to CSIs, to crime scene analysis, looking at the risks in a particular crime scene before you enter, or even looking at things like blood transfusion in the biosciences. And what I wanted to do today, and why we're doing this talk, isn't really to talk about Resimion and what it is, and to take you through the platform. What I wanted to do today was to share what we've learned from running forensic scenarios in the platform. Because we've now run 9,000 scenarios, 49% of those, so almost half of those scenarios that have run, are forensic or forensic science based. And that's what I want to talk about here. When students are running through the scenarios, everything that they do is recorded. Every decision that they make, if they use hints, they manipulate, say they're looking at a picture of a crime scene and they decide to rotate it or flip it or zoom in. Maybe they tag images, maybe they're writing a report. All of that is tracked inside of the Resimion platform and gives us insights into student behavior and you as a lecturer or trainer, insights into how the users are actually responding to that scene. And it's great to get feedback because it helps you understand whether your learners have consumed the content in the way that you expect, how they're behaving, whether they do understand the concepts that they're applying, whether they're finding certain things tricky. It also allows a student to get valuable feedback in real time as they're working through those scenarios. So today is about what we've learned from applying Resimion. I'm not here to talk about Resimion itself, but I'll certainly take questions if need be. And we do have other sessions that cover what Resimion is on the website and so on. So today is about what we've learned. So what type of forensic scenarios do we actually run? They break down into 3 different parts. The scenarios are created by lecturers, by trainers, by forces, by others across the world, and they fall into 3 main categories. The first is questions and facts, as we call them. So they're things like multiple choice questions, general knowledge, testing, pick the right image, for example. And that accounts for just under 40% of the scenarios that are created. They're usually really quick scenarios that allow students on their phone to have maybe 5 or 10 minutes to go through 10 multiple choice questions, pick the right answer, or maybe identify the right image or match up images. And very similar if you've used tools like iSpring or Mentimeter before, it's a very similar type of thing. The only difference here is we're tracking every interaction they make. So we understand how long they've taken to answer each particular question, the path that they have taken through the questions, and it can then be used for assessment, and it can be recorded as part of maybe a daily, weekly, or whatever it is, part of a lecture module. The second type of path-based scenarios, that accounts for 50% of the scenarios created. And this is where we start to get more problem-based. Path-based scenarios are scenarios where you're presenting your learners or students with a particular problem. And that problem requires some sort of solution. That might be an outcome, that might be a hypothesis, that might be identifying the risks in a scene. But a path-based scenario usually has a number of paths from the initial problem, the scenario that you've presented your students or learners with, working through to the end of the scenario, where there might be one or multiple outcomes, some of which are right and some of which are wrong, and then making decisions, maybe asking interview questions, maybe taking other types of decisions along the way. That's great for things like interviews, things like evidence analysis, lab processes, or other types of lab techniques. Then the third type, which is much harder to create because of the nature, is what we call scene-based scenarios or image-based scenarios. That's where you're presenting, for example, a full crime scene or a courtroom, and you're allowing your students to get very immersive with that experience. They're going into the scene, they're drilling down at different parts, and the images are changing as they're kind of moving around the scene. They're able to pull out parts of the image and analyze them using image analysis tools built into the platform. And they can even start to write full reports and tag up evidence. So they can pull out maybe a particular type of risk, turn that into a very small image, and pull that into a written report that they're writing as part of the platform. So for example, if we take a car crash, one of our lecturers in institutions created a car crash. The scenario runs for 2 hours. It's a scene-based scenario, and you start by arriving at the scene, you go through an interview process, then you actually start to move around inside of the car, pulling out different parts of the scene for evidence, writing up risk reports, and starting to then take those evidence pieces that you've pulled out of the scene back to the lab, where you can then run lab processes. So fully interactive, students fully interact with the scene, the images, they pull out different parts and work with it, and it allows them to have a very immersive and kind of free and open experience. So that's 12% of the scenarios that get created in our platform. By far, the most common type that's being created using scenario-based learning right now are the path-based scenarios that have a defined number of paths from the objective that's set at the start right the way through to the outcomes that are set at the end. So what are some examples, just to kind of help understand this a bit more? You can see here 4 different examples. On the left-hand side of my screen, I've got 2 that are running inside of the Resimion phone app. So we offer a phone app and a web browser-based interface. Typically, the phone app is used for 5, 10, 15-minute scenarios that are very quick, maybe the MCQs or the path-based scenarios. The web browser is used for 2 or 3 hour assessments where users are drilling down into scenes or writing complex reports. So you can see here we've got some, for example, the suspect's footwear. It's just a very basic path-based scenario where the user has been presented with a problem at the top. So you've been provided with the suspect's footwear. You're going to go through and you're going to do a visual examination. You have 5 minutes to run through and run some procedures against that footwear to then go through and determine whether you have enough to return that to maybe the CSI manager, or whether you need more data. And similarly with things like stomach contents analysis, we actually can bring up images and the user can look at images, zoom them in, decide what to do next as part of that stomach contents analysis scenario that they're running. And then up in the right-hand corner, the web browser scenario is a full crime scene that's actually being analyzed for risk, and understanding when you've arrived at that particular crime scene, what processes you're going to run through to be able to start work on that crime scene. You end up at the end of that scenario writing a full report, and you have different amounts of time for the stages. So you will see that in all of these, There are counters at the bottom counting down. In some of these, you have points values. So every decision you make may give you more points or may remove points. And in one of them, the stomach contents analysis, every action you take may well cost money. If you decide to order a lab test or a lab process, that may well have an impact on your budget for you. So students are working in a relatively realistic way when they're making decisions and understanding the decisions and the impacts of those decisions that they take. And that's what Resimion does. It allows you to design the scenarios that are then delivered either on a kind of informal basis or on a much more formative or summative assessment basis for students, whilst giving them kind of realistic impacts on the decisions that they choose to make. So what about student interaction? How long are these forensic scenarios running for? So if you remember, we had 9,000, about half of those are forensics, about 4,500. What we've done is we've looked at the data that we've been using across HE and FE, and we've had a couple of kind of professional, kind of non-educational organizations using this as well. Taking all of that data, what I've done is I've aggregated some of it together and just created some stats to help understand how students are choosing to work with these scenarios that are being run. And I think probably one of the most interesting is actually the choice of device that they use when they're running these scenarios. So not every scenario allows users to use either their phone or their web browser. And the reason for that is because you don't want students spending 2 or 3 hours performing an assessment on a phone. And that typically just doesn't work very well. If they're staring at a phone for 2 hours, you're not going to get the best results. So for some types of scenario, we don't allow them to use their phones. We only allow them to use a web browser. But where they have a choice, it's about 50-50. So when they're interacting with forensic scenarios, whether they're MCQs, whether they're path-based scenarios that are running through making decisions, it's about 50-50. And that's really interesting because students are actually choosing to use different devices depending on usually what they have available. Many choose to do it on their phone, even though they have a full laptop or desktop available to run the scenario. It's not a technology limitation for some. But it also helps, particularly with digital poverty. And because what we're finding is many students don't have laptops available. They may be stuck to going into a library on campus. Obviously, there's a problem of going into campus at the moment. So they may not have a desktop available. Maybe they're limited to an iPad or a phone, and using scenarios like this has allowed them to use their phones and continue to kind of be part of the learning experience. And these scenarios kind of break down into 3 parts. There are informal ones that are run during a lecture. Maybe the whole cohort of students are competing against each other for points. They run usually for about 6 minutes on average, typically 5 to 15 minutes that are being run in a lecture, right the way up to the kind of summative assessments, which are running on average for 48 minutes. With the shortest typically being for a kind of summative assessment has been 30 minutes, some running up to 2.5 or even in one case 3 hours. And scenarios run for a particular amount of time. Typically they will run for that amount of time, for example, for 30 minutes. But an important question is to understand whether students use all of that time or not. So if you're given 30 minutes, just like an exam, if you're given 30 minutes, do students consume all of that time? Actually, it looks like only 15% of students run for the full amount of time in a scenario that they have available, which was very surprising when we ran the stats. 55% of students use 80 to 90%. So the majority of students are using most of the time, but very few students actually use all of the time. So when they feel they're done with a scenario, they do exit the scenario, they don't sit there and wait. And very few students are actually rushing through this. What we have found is we're able to identify students that are maybe sitting together, or one is working through a scenario with another. One student runs through the scenario and then another one does it in maybe 2 minutes because they know all of the answers, or they've copied their friend, and we're able to now use that to identify who is potentially working through others. What about accessibility and inclusivity? Should we make forensic scenarios accessible? Should we try? I think everybody will probably say yes, we absolutely should. In October 2020, we ran a survey to students asking them if they believed we should add features to Resimion to give them more in terms of accessibility or to make Resimion easier to use. The response was absolutely overwhelming. Long story short, we've added features, and to date, we now have 1.5% of all of our scenarios are running with one or more of the accessibility features enabled. There are 4 features we've added to Resimion, and we've got multi-language coming soon. As here, you can see this in US English, for example. There are 4 features, and you can see the feature usage in the chart down on the right-hand side. And by far, background color, changing the background color of the panels and of the pages in Resimion has been the most popular option. Almost 1.2% of all the scenarios that are running, students are changing the background color. Sometimes they're bright blue, sometimes they're yellow. We've had students that have changed colors to be red on black, for example, where it suits their particular needs. And we've realized that's a very important part of actually delivering scenarios that students can customize the experience for them. And 6% of the scenarios are also running for extra time. So as a lecturer, you're able to control how long a scenario runs for users, whether they get extra time. And in this case, 6% have been given extra time and are using that extra time as well. It's particularly important at the moment with remote working, because when you're in person with a student, you can typically work better with visual needs than you can remotely. Things like screen readers, we've just realized, and students have told us, just aren't enough to run through complex or immersive scenarios like this. What about engagement? When a student's actually playing, again, very interesting stats that we run here, and I'm not going to run through this in too much detail because I think it will be available in the video later, the post recording. But what we found is it's all about reminders and how often we remind students to go and take the scenario. If we don't give a reminder to the student, or the lecturer doesn't remind the student manually, only 78% of students engage with the scenario. If we go with a generic, hey, don't forget to run through the scenario and take it, 87% actually engage. If we use what we call peer reminders, and a peer reminder is where we remind students that they haven't taken it, but actually you haven't taken it, but 42% of your peers already have taken it. And then you get another reminder the following day, 60% of your peers have already taken it. Don't forget to go and run through this scenario. What we see is engagement jumps up to 98%. So it's actually significantly different if you turn on reminders and reminders come through. And you can see here the effect over the top right-hand chart, the effect of receiving a reminder every day at midday. You can see then students playing. If I go back, you can see students then playing the scenario, running through the scenarios. In this case, this was an assessment once they've received the reminder. And it's pretty much consistent over a 7-day period. They receive the reminder and sometime later that day, they're then running through it. How often do students change their mind? Quite an interesting question that we've looked at in some detail. Every action and decision that's taken inside of the Resimion platform is recorded. You can see some examples of timelines here for RNA processing and splicing, and also a forensic analysis scenario that we've run. You can also see we create very complicated analysis. If you want to see them, you're able to see exactly how students have worked through a scenario, and they can get very, very complex. What some scenarios do is allow students to change their mind. They can make a decision, then they can undo that decision and decide to go back and make a different decision. Only 10% of the scenarios that are in the system have had that enabled, just because either a lecturer or the designer of the scenario has allowed it. What's even more interesting is only 1% of students actually appear to change their mind. So even though that up to 10% of the scenarios that run allow students to change their mind, once they've locked in a choice, that choice has typically been locked in, and very few students go back and want to change their mind. That was very insightful because we spent a lot of time adding functionality to allow students to reflect on a decision and maybe go back and change a decision that they've made. And actually, they don't seem to. Once they've made the decision, that's it. It's locked in and they're running with it. Image manipulation was another kind of interesting insight that we found. I'm sure many will be delivering remote crime scenes or remote images that are in PowerPoints or maybe in other applications that you want students to be looking through, finding things and working with in some way. We used to deliver a static image. One of the really, really important lessons that we learned was through flipping the image. And what we did was we took a scenario that was due to be run. We just set up a very simple algorithm that would display an image, and would actually flip it halfway, would flip it for half of the students that were about to take that scenario. Why? Because what we believed was that students were looking only in certain parts of the image, and that there was probably a preference for the right-hand side of an image versus the left. Very, very unscientific. We just flipped half of the images that students got. And what we found was that for the 50% that we flipped, they appeared to be better. Now, it was a very basic hypothesis. It was based on nothing, and it was certainly not a scientific approach. But what it did was allow us to add image manipulation tools so that you could then take images of scenes or cells or whatever you're looking at, various other types of evidence or pictures, and allow students to zoom them, to flip them, to change the colors and filters. And the surprise that we had was that 80% of scenarios now have students manipulating images, even if it's just to zoom them in or to flip them around or rotate them. And you can see the stats here. So image manipulation became a really big part of what we need to do when we're delivering scenarios. Obviously, we have all the image security here. So if we're delivering potentially, I wouldn't say illegal images, but images that contain content that is very difficult to share remotely, we've got all of the security features built in. So all of those are still maintained, such as the watermarking, the flip over image, and so on. But actually, these features, zooming, flipping, and changing colors, have become really popular. And almost all students now, when they're interacting, use those particular features. So then just to kind of finish up here, what are the problems with a scenario-based approach? Scenario-based learning gives students an immersive experience. It gives them the ability to run through scenarios and understand how they are interacting with different decisions that are made. They're getting feedback from those decisions. That's great. But what are some of the problems? The first has been digital poverty. Before we actually created a phone app, we expected most students to have access to a web browser. And that was a mistake that we made very early on, actually in 2019, because not all students had access to a web browser at the time that there was an expectation that they could go and run the scenario. Creating the phone app has opened this up to double the number of students that we expected. And now, through digital poverty, through not having laptops or access to full web browsers, it means students can still run through the app and still run through scenarios. And the other problem we've come across is fear of the unknown. It is a very potentially panicking experience when students are given a scenario for the first time. Maybe they're some of the best students that you have. They've really kind of engaged. They've focused on building all of the knowledge that you've given them. You put them into a scenario and suddenly they've got a counter that's counting down. They've got point scores or monetary values that they need to be monitoring, and you're asking them to make decisions. And some students actually find that very difficult because you put them into a situation where they feel like they need to deliver very quickly. And that's why practice here is so important. It's a very different experience. 95% of the feedback we get is really positive. But the 5% where we don't get positive feedback is that they wish they'd been able to do more practice runs. They wish they'd experienced a scenario before they'd actually run through it. So it can be very overwhelming sometimes, and practice is the kind of response to that. And for the lecturer or for the trainer or for a professional developing scenarios, it can appear very difficult at first glance to create scenarios like this. We offer a design service, and what we often do is get people to start small, experiment, and get help from others, because chances are if you're doing something like DNA analysis or crime scene analysis, somebody else has probably done it, and we can connect them with you to work through. And collaborative creation is key. If you're working on scenarios together, then chances are you're going to come up with a scenario that's 3 or 4 times better than if you just try and do one by yourself. So in summary, scenario-based learning, it's a really immersive experience. It can be very hard to develop, but whether you're using Resimion or another platform to deliver something like this, students, interestingly, almost 50% of them chose to use their phone to run through these scenarios, not a web browser, because that was their device of choice. And 80% wanted to manipulate what they could see. They wanted to flip images around. They wanted to zoom in. They wanted to change the color in some form. So they wanted to manipulate what they could see. So when you're delivering content and resources, allowing students to be able to manipulate it is really important. We found 1.5% of students wanted to use accessibility features and enabled them, which became really, really important. And I guess the last really important lesson we learned from this was peer reminders. If students get peer reminders from us, we found engagement went up to 98% because they understood that other people had done it and that they needed to catch up, versus, hey, you know, don't forget to run this particular scenario or do this particular assessment. And then lastly, reverse scenario-based learning. What we actually have now are a number of students creating scenarios as part of a project and handing those in as part of an assessment. So the assessment isn't running through the scenario anymore. The assessment is creating the scenario. It's thinking about the paths that you have to run through, the decisions that you have to make when maybe you're analysing a crime scene or assessing risk or running through an interview, versus those that maybe are the wrong choices. And it gets students to think about the different tree and the different hierarchy of decisions that are right and wrong, which helps them understand the content even more, because they're no longer experiencing and experimenting with it. They're now actually teaching others as a result, which makes a significant difference to how they consume and use the knowledge. So that's kind of the Resimion learnings, a really quick overview of Resimion and what we've learned as a result. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was an excellent talk, and I'm deeply impressed by the tool that you've created in what is a relatively short time frame, and how it really probes those higher order cognitive skills in an online environment, and therefore by default creates something that challenges students and can't be easily solved by a quick Google search. We do have some questions from people in the meeting. If anyone else has one, please post it now. So the first one is about the time it takes the academics to create the scenarios. I guess we could just expand that question slightly and talk about any kind of co-creation opportunities with students creating scenarios.
Okay, so I guess there are two answers to this. The first is, let me tackle the last part of that first. So students creating scenarios, one of the theories is that if you get students to create scenarios as part of projects, then potentially you can take those for next year and use those to deliver a scenario-based learning experience. That's working for some institutions. The problem often comes around intellectual property and whether the student owns the scenario or whether they don't. And some institutions have run into problems previously with that. So it works very well to actually create the content, and you can take the best of different student scenarios and put them together through an interactive designer. But sometimes you can run into problems with whether the student owns that or whether the university owns that. In terms of creating collaboratively, there are two things we'd encourage. The first is we offer a whole bunch of templates and pre-built scenarios that you can take and adapt. It's often easier to adapt one than it is to create something from scratch. And we will often collaborate with you. So more often than not, we receive a Word document full of a bunch of ideas. We will take that Word document and turn it into a scenario that you can then go and adapt. But actually, the really best approach is that you take something such as a template and use your fellow lecturers or academics to collaborate on that particular scenario, because you can all access the same area and work together on that scenario to build it. And the quality of the scenario that comes out is often far better than if you're doing it alone.
Thank you very much, Dan. So the next question is a very specific one from Hannah about any data on the accuracy of the students navigating the simulation compared to the time that they actually spend on the scenario itself.
Yes, so one of the things that we do is create something called the optimal path. So when you create a scenario, the system looks at how you get from the problem right the way through to the different objectives, and you've identified which objectives are correct and which objectives are partially correct. The system will work out based on the tree which is the optimal path, and it will then tell you which students are on the optimal path, which aren't, and how far away they are from that particular optimal path. We do have stats and data on that. I don't have them here to share today, but it's something that we do share with our user base, particularly for their own students.
Thank you. A question from Nathan now. What media types can be used in the scenarios, e.g. pictures, videos?
So right now we support 3 types. The first is text. The reason I say text is because people often forget that you can give, say, a bunch of lab results or a bunch of bullet points. And that's really important because if you are using a screen reader for accessibility, text is a media that screen reader can read. And you don't need to do any more work around. But we also then support images of all sorts of different types and video. Video works particularly well for something like a courtroom or maybe an FOA interview where you're asking a police officer questions, for example, as a CSI, and the police officer then actually appears in a little video window giving you an answer to that particular question. So right now it's text, it's image, and it's video.
Thank you. And the final question is one from myself. So I'm quite interested in the broader use of simulations. So you mentioned in your talk about the use of coins in one of your scenarios, i.e. adding the pressure of resource. So I'm interested in adding other kind of measures like that, like time restraints and such like, and what kind of influence that has on the students' decision processes and how they navigate the scenarios.
So another lesson that we learned that I haven't covered here is we allow the designer to add any sorts of constraints and any sorts of what we call measures that they like. So you can have monetary budgets, you can have points, you can add multiple countdowns, and you can be really smart. So as a scenario is counting down, maybe 10 minutes in, because a particular event you're simulating has happened, you can now take away some of the decisions that students can make. So they can only make those decisions if they're less than 10 minutes into a scenario or more than X into a scenario, or they've got more or less than certain points values. Now, the problem with adding too many different kind of constraints or metrics is if students are playing this for the first time or they're very early on in the experience, if you give them too many different impacts from a decision, they find it very hard to manage, particularly if they're on a phone. So if we're giving them, I don't know, if we take a kind of a really simple example, that there is a crime scene, evidence quality is deteriorating at some given rate. We've got evidence quality counting down, so they're under pressure to deal with maybe all the volatiles or something else. We've got a timer counting down because they've only got 10 minutes. Maybe we've added a budget in, the amount of time or money they're going to spend doing certain things. Maybe we've added in a whole bunch of other risks or a risk level. The more measures you add, the more complicated it gets for the student to understand what the impact is. And as a result, the stress level of that student goes up significantly. So my answer to that is keep it simple. If you want to make it more comprehensive, it's better to break a scenario up into multiple points than to bombard them with a huge bunch of metrics. But you can add any constraints or metrics that you like. You can call them what you like. You can add numbers, percentages. You can have them count down or count up as you wish, but limit the number that you expose a student to because it can often be a bit too overwhelming.
Thank you so much, Dan. So that's the end of the questions. And I'd just like to finish by reading out a comment from Hannah, which says, "What a cool program," which I think is a lovely way to end a talk.